the benefit, the joy, the gift that Be More Pirate gives me still and other people is in simplest terms that ability to speak your mind, right? So what happened? So in the Pirate Code 2.0 I was putting forward, I was, just trying to call bullshit on the things that need calling bullshit on, like their business plans. Because it's got some numbers on it, everyone thinks, right, okay, that's what's going to happen. And we can fall into a trap of thinking change innovation is about starting something, but usually it's about stopping something, and that's much harder to do.
And this has been a kind of a bit of a mission of yours, hasn't it? One of my absolute favourite books is Be More Pirate. One of my colleagues recommended it to me, and I love it. And it's a fantastically rich. I guess it started as a metaphor, but there's actually a historical truth to it. Can you talk a little bit about why you chose piracy to make some deeper points?
Sure. And yeah, it's been great because it got a really warm reception within Google. Crystal Eisinger was one of the first people to get hands on it, and we've done lots of great stuff together as a result. I'm very grateful for all the support actually that you and the other teams gave the book. And it's because I've worked with young people and young innovators and entrepreneurs an awful lot over my life, and I've often used, as many people have, like Steve Jobs famously called I'd rather be a pirate than join the Navy, as a euphemism, as a metaphor. And I never really understood what I meant by that. And as I was getting ready to leave Liberty, I'd always said that I'd leave Liberty when I got old. And when I was challenged on that, I said, that would be 40, because I started Liberty in my 20s and I was 40. That's never going to, I'll be dead by then. And so I needed a vehicle that was going to get me out of Liberty. And I was also slightly frustrated, not at Liberty per se, but the industry of change, because like you say, change is a constant. And I found I lost my belief a little bit in words like change and innovation. And I think we can very often happily go to a 2-day innovation offsite, come up with some new names for doing the same shit, and then all go back to work. And I just couldn't do that anymore. And the more Post-it notes that went on the wall, the more I wanted to cover myself in them. And what became clear was that we can fall into a trap of thinking change and innovation is about starting something, but usually it's about stopping something, and that's much harder to do. And at a big level, that's what we need to do. In a world that is 60% over its biosphere capacity, World Resource Day, or whatever, I can't remember exactly what it's called, is now in August. Every year, the day that we use up the world's natural resources gets earlier. So anybody whose business model is remotely connected to something consumerist in its very core notion, who isn't just kind of backfilling sustainability principles, is going to find themselves on the wrong side of history pretty quickly. So the change that's required isn't the change that we've known. And if we get anywhere near the kind of change that's still advocated for, we're still going to be behind where we need to be. So anything less than revolution or rebellion isn't quite touching where we need to go to. So that's where I started. I began the process of writing a book to challenge myself, to get me out of Liberty as a kind of a vehicle for whatever was going to come next. And to be really honest, I don't admit this all the time, I wrote the world's most boring book. I got 20,000 words into a book called Purpose First. It was fucking dismal. And it was because I was trying to be a grown-up, right? And I thought, I'm going to write a book, and I'm going to write really useful, clever language, and I went away and I started sharing it with people, and they're like, wow, what's happened to you? And I did a workshop on it with some young entrepreneurs I was working. They're like, what's happened, Sam? Where's all the rocket ships? Where's all the pirates? And I went back to my desk and I had this note, where's all the pirates? And I thought, why do I always talk about pirates? And I went to the British Library and then to the Greenwich Maritime Museum. And I suddenly discovered that the history we know of pirates is not the true history of pirates. And the true history of pirates, 300 years ago, they were the social entrepreneurs of their day. They were absolute pioneers. And their true place in history is on the great history of the working class and change makers, and probably somewhere between the Chartists and the early reformist movements and the cooperative trade unions and civil rights. That's actually the impact they made. And it's not the story we tell. And so by grounding their stories there was this kind of unlock and update to the metaphor. And it turns out not just a vehicle for me to kind of get my thoughts together for where change was going to go next, but then it ended up being a surprising success.
Well, they were famous, weren't you? You talk about them as the first pioneers of branding. You know, I'm wearing my skull and crossbones, or actually it's skis, not crossbones, but it's the closest I could get.
I've got a skull on here. If it were that kind of show, I'd take my top off and show you my pirate tattoos.
The dual governance that they had, the social insurance against injury, the universal suffrage. It was a very sort of gender equal environment, pay equality, same-sex marriage. They were pioneers in so many ways. And you extracted these wonderful codes, these pirate codes or principles from how they lived, which I just think are wonderful. The Pirate Code 1.0, volume 1, I guess, of the book, challenge the establishment, create, innovate, and disrupt. Fiercely independent, led by principles, honest about profit, highly talented but underappreciated. Really recognizable. Now the 2.0, right? The 2.0. Can you talk about your 2.0?
Yeah, and I still apply the principles of pirate codes to wherever I go. This shared idea of trust and values-based decision making, and it's much like the fear fog stasis I got to earlier on. If we don't address the reality that we're working with, then we end up, and you know this. You've been in enough big corporates, well intended, but they have to write words on the walls because they can't remember that their values are simple things like honesty and trust, right? So what happens? So in the Pirate Code 2.0 I was putting forward, I was, just trying to call bullshit on the things that need calling bullshit on, like their business plans. We know what that's like. Of course, there are times when a plan is very useful, but there's an awful lot of times when we can mistake a spreadsheet for reality. Because it's got some numbers on it, everyone thinks, right, okay, that's what's going to happen. And that can take away our agency. It can take away our accountability. It can take away our ability, our decision-making and responsibility for that, which is not on the plan. That's not necessarily the best way to govern our lives. I talk about the citizen shift, which is the very brilliant concept of a man called John Alexander. And he charts, there was once a time that we were subject, and then we became consumer as a dominant narrative, and now is the time to move to citizen, to be an individual with agency and to be a collective with responsibility, not determined solely by being a unit of consumption, which I really believe in. And these notions are big challenges to the old rules that we face. And my argument is that as we entered the 21st century, it was widely heralded that creativity is the number one skill that we all need, right? But as I look around me, or more importantly, as I think to the young people who my work has mainly been dedicated to, or even my children, I don't think they see a world which rewards creativity. I think they see a world which rewards conformity. And so the subtext is fit in, and the messages stand out. And then that creates a dichotomy of dishonesty around us, which I think is very troublesome. And so the real call is when you see this dishonesty, it's now is the time to stand up and to speak up and to stand up for these things that we believe in. And what happens when we begin to challenge the rules? And for lots of people, rule breaking sounds very scary, very risky and uncomfortable. We want to protect that which is around us. But I think it's shifted, right? And rule breaking is no longer the irresponsible thing to do. It is the responsible thing to do. Because it's by following a lot of the rules that are outdated that we've got here. So this, so much of the culture that governs our organizations is just habits. It's just behaviors. And often those behaviors and habits, I either don't come from the best place, B, they weren't very well thought through at the time, and C, very often we need an update, especially in the fast moving world that we're in. So I did a survey of 4,000 person UK workforce survey just before the pandemic on a piece I was writing and as a follow-up to Be My Pirate. My question number one was, have you been in a meeting in the last 6 weeks where you said yes, you agreed to something that internally you disagreed with? Any guess on the percentage of people who'd said yes to something that really they wanted to say no to?
I'd say more than 50%.
85%.
85.
Right? 85%. Subsequent question. Having said verbally yes to something that internally you meant no, did you then go on to do something to sabotage the thing that you'd said yes to? 67%. 67. Right? The average meeting size is 7 people. That means you can only trust 1.5 people to actually say yes to something they believe to and then follow it through with intention. And
Wow.
and this comes from and I learned this part of it through the uncertainty experts. We have an ingrained fear of speaking up. There are lots of people don't, and to empathize with this, because no one wants to be excluded from a social group. To speak up risks your status, your place of safety. So it's very easy for us to try to fit in. But many people know that, even if the question is seemingly obvious, like, you must be ridiculous. Is that really the timeline? That can't actually be the budget. Like, these are the questions inside us. Instead we go, yep, okay, I think, yeah, great. and our ability, so those are some of the rules I'm talking about. The rule there is that we must fit in, and we must not speak out, and we shouldn't challenge, even if that's what's going through our heads. And the benefit, the joy, the gift that Be More Pirate gives me still and other people is in simplest terms, that ability to speak your mind when your first response is to fit in.
Well, that really resonates with me. We did a study in Google some years ago to try and decode and figure out the difference between a fantastically high-performing team versus a good team. Most teams are good, but what separates the great teams from the good ones? And it boiled down to a simple thing: psychological safety. And psychological safety in the sense that you feel comfortable to take risks, to speak up, to come out of your comfort zone, knowing that your colleagues will not knock you down. They kind of expect that. They'll pick you back up, tap you on the back, and on you go. And where failure and experimentation within that is a badge of honor. This is an environment in which high innovation happens because there's risk taking and the safety or the normalcy of doing everything that you just described, or the antithesis of the sort of not speaking up side of things. So it absolutely resonates with our experience, but it's very difficult to create that context. It requires intention, doesn't it?
Yeah, what it is. It sits between the two projects, and for me, Liberty and To Be More Pirate and to Uncertainty Experts, it's just all very much. I mean, it's not as clear to the external world as I wish it was to me, but they're still working on the same processes. And what I've learned in Uncertainty, was for me to get beneath. Be More Pirate was an unexpected success and an inspiration to lots of people, but I didn't really understand why, what was causing action. So that's kind of what prompted me into Uncertainty. So the thing that I've learned here, and this is from one of the uncertainty experts, Dr. Vivian Ming, who began life as a very depressed young man, arrived one night with a gun, nearly took his own life. An intervention was made and got into university, ended up turning out was an absolutely gifted neuroscientist, computational neuroscientist, top of his class, Stanford, MIT, all that kind of thing. Still drastically unhappy, was able to confront the inner fears, and it was around gender transition, went through gender transition, kind of fully realized Dr. Ming's potential, got married, has now got a family, multiple entrepreneur, and is doing amazing things, bringing technology to the world. And not only does she do multiple studies of teams, and she found a very similar result, and actually in over, I can't remember, several million data sets. This sense, what she observed of this thing that created teams where safety, trust, communication, she measured it on a number of different measures. Actually, she boiled it down even further, and it was to a place of sacrifice. If you are willing to make a sacrifice, a cost to yourself for someone else, this is when teams outperform. And not just teams, this is where you begin to be able to measure long-term life outcomes, like, even things like posture, grip, actual, like the full rounded experience of being a human, as well as increased potential and promotion. But it's got to be genuine. So it's this notion that, it's a counterintuitive notion that the people who win the race are the ones who stop for their race fellow who fell, and not try and win. There's a real gamesmanship to it. It's fascinating, but it goes into that place. I think social safety provides the wrapper, but this goes a step further into what is the behavior, what is the relationship that we then have. And that notion of sacrifice really struck a chord with me. And what she also taught me was around how the brain updates itself. And the Bayesian model of the brain, which is widely accepted now, is that the brain is a prediction machine. So it runs millions and millions and millions of projections, and that accelerates when you go into uncertainty. So it goes onto hyperdrive and runs countless millions of predictions to keep you alive. And that's why uncertainty is so exhausting, because the cognitive workload is so great. and its predictions are based on what it's seen before. The brain doesn't really have much of imagination, kind of weirdly. So because every single time you've gone on that journey, it's always worked out. Whenever you've run into that argument, when you've said this, it's always got better. When you've gone to that gym, so the brain knows that, so it sees familiar patterns and it goes into them. When it's regularly challenged with new patterns, it has to work in a more creative sense, and its portfolio, its palette of options becomes greater. So when we saw the uncertainty experts, because they've seen near death, because they've seen tragedy, their brain's prediction model is very wide, and it can assimilate itself to numerous different outcomes and perceive them all to perhaps have chances of learning or opportunity, whereas the human the natural instinct is to preserve ourselves, to protect ourselves. So our brain would limit our life experience. And if the less experience you have, the less prediction, and the smaller the model the brain is able to draw from. So the more it naturally limits you. So updating the prediction engines of our brain is really important to exactly that, to allow us to create spaces where we are more comfortable, or crucially, I can sit with someone who I don't recognize, who speaks different from me, has a different world outlook, and I can still be comfortable within this conversation. And they, at an embodied level, will feel my relaxedness with them. And then we will begin to, and we will term it psychological safety. But what's happening here is a kind of chemical exchange based on some pretty primal stuff.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I mean, we're battling millennia of human evolution, aren't we? It's quite useful to have these heuristics, these pattern recognition machines on our shoulders when you're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, but not so useful when you're facing chaos. And the example I love to talk about on this is Nokia, bless them. Nokia, not the network equipment provider, but the ones that used to do handsets. I had a 6210, brilliant phone, right? Battery lasts 3.5 weeks. You got all your contacts saved, green screen, all that sort of stuff. They
Snake.
have more. Yeah, exactly. Snake. WAP, early version of mobile. And in 2007, they had more share of the handset market globally than all of the other players put together. But then Steve Jobs steps onto the stage, announces the iPhone, and the collective consciousness, in this case of Nokia, said, I've seen this before. This is just another device, another new kid on the block. And what they failed to recognize, perhaps because of the sort of maybe a collective version of this absence of plasticity, is that the game had shifted, right? It was now about the ecosystem and the apps and the music and everything else, not the device. It had left that. And of course, the rest is history. Nokia don't exist, not in the handset form, a few IPR licenses here and there. But I would argue in 2007, if you or I had been talking about the sort of bastion's high watermark of innovation, we probably would have been using Nokia as the example. Having started in forestry and made rubber boots and then pivoted over to telecommunications. So I think what you're describing here exists not only at an individual level but also a collective level. Would you agree with that?
I would very much so, yeah. And I've done a lot of reading and thinking about the opportunities of collective intelligence, and it's one of the reasons we insist on the events being live, because there is a degree of synchrony that takes place. We were looking at seeing if we get some HRV equipment in, but the hypothesis would be that by attending a live event, which is fairly high stimulus, there'll be a degree of synchrony of heart rates and everything else because we are coming together. So collective intelligence can exist, and I would therefore further hypothesize that collective dissonance can also exist. And the atrophy, let's call it that must have taken place at Nokia because of the certainty that they had, meant this diminished experience. To bring the mobile analogy further, there was a study of 50,000 mobile phone users using their geolocation data, and after something like 3 days data analysis, every single one of their movements could be predicted to a 97% accuracy rate, because we are such predictable human beings, right? But if you're not taking a new path, if you're not choosing something you've never tried before, if you're not, then your worldview becomes smaller and you become less aware of the threats around you. So maintaining your tolerance to uncertainty means maintaining a degree of hypervigilance, which means maintaining yourself relatively close to the risks that come. And this presents an interesting challenge to your organization, because you are so dominant. No one would imagine that 6 years from now we'll be looking back going, wow, how did Google not see that coming? But, the the thing you must, and I know you talk about this, the vigilance you need now is not against necessarily the next up and comer. It's a vigilance against your own dominance and not mistaking that for complacency.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And, as a proud Kiwi, it's a national obligation to talk about the All Blacks rugby team. And one of the principles that they work with is the saying is, when you're on top of your game, you change your game. So the sense of sort of relentless restlessness, that's hard to say, relentless restlessness, this idea that although it may be successful today, we need to sort of move on and be in a different place tomorrow and keep moving. And that's one of the reasons that this is one of the most successful sporting teams over a 100-year period in history. Sam, I could talk to you all night. I'll spare you that. It's been a huge honor. I'm a big fanboy of yours. And really looking forward to the uncertainty experts. Thank you so much for joining me. You're an inspiration.
Thanks, man. I really, really appreciate it. And I know that, the same goes to you. And I know that the thing that really impressed me and why I've followed you is finding about how much you did outside. I know what you do inside Google is pretty innovative, but through you already mentioned awesome crystallizing, I found about how much you do outside. So my respects also to you.
Thank you, sir.